medical committee. Is that the name of the medical board ministry? Okay, the medical board and the ministry, AVMCC. Okay, I want to thank them for inviting me to this occasion. I want to thank them for giving me the opportunity to address this topic, which is very close to my heart, and to seek to spread the gospel. This is like a home. It is not like a homecoming experience. It is a homecoming experience because I actually belong to this community, and I belong to a smaller community which grew out of this community, and which that smaller community is what I consider to this day to be my family church, and that is the Chapel of St. Luke's in Lasuf. And maybe in the course of this discussion, the reason why we have that affinity will emerge. In any case, I'm really happy to be here. Mental health is something that has received a lot of attention in the recent past. It's had a very turbulent history as a topic, and it hasn't been insulated even from political considerations. During the time of our predecessors, the first generation psychiatrists in Nigeria, people like Professor Lambo, Professor Asuni, it was considered that Nigerians and the generality of black people were not capable of experiencing depression, which is actually one of the most important and most common types of mental health challenge that we're going to talk about. And the reason why we were not considered capable of experiencing depression was that they felt, the Europeans who wrote the books, who wrote the textbooks of the times, felt that our people were not capable of reflection, and that we need to be very introspective and reflective in order to be able to experience depression. The work of Professor Ade Ilambo and others of his generation debunked some of those stupid and racist thinking. So that's how it landed on the ground. And then, generally, up till a few years ago, mental health or mental illness was a taboo topic. It was not something that was discussed in polite society. And people tended to look on it as an us and them thing. And the face of mental illness that people were aware of was maybe the naked person sitting by the roadside, unable to take care of himself, or being an object of fun that little children passing by will be throwing stones at or ridiculing. In this environment, another phase of mental illness, which was not recognized as such, was the old, many of us who traveled to villages in years past might see an old lady sitting by the roadside, and people are throwing stones at her. And then you ask, why are you throwing, you ask the people, if you stop and you ask the people, why are you being so wicked to this old lady? They will actually stone them and leave them to die. Why are you doing this to this elderly lady? They will say she's a witch. And if you ask them, how do you know that she's a witch? They will say she confessed. And maybe what had happened was that in the depth of a deep psychotic depression, in the previous few days, the woman had been saying that all the children who died in the neighborhood were killed by her. And the audience would take that literally, and because she had killed so many children, the only justice that was appropriate to meet out to her was to kill her, was to stone her to death. First of all, throw her outside the boundaries of society, and then kill her in the same way that she had killed those people. If you look back on it now, from a professional standpoint as a psychiatrist, and you realize that there's a condition called psychotic depression in which a person, of course, depressions generally are more common in women than men. There's a condition in which a person in the depth of depression can start attributing to herself things that she did not do. If you sit with her and talk with her, I'm the worst person in this world. All the things that have gone wrong in this world are because of me. It's just a reflection of how bad she's feeling. But our people didn't see it. Since our people did not recognize it, they did not even recognize it as a mental illness, they felt that whatever she was saying was true. In a few mental health conditions, such as what I've described there, what the person is saying is actually not true. It's just reflective of how she's feeling. To give you the broad spread of possibilities, there's a particular type of mental illness which is the opposite of what I've described, in which case the person, instead of feeling bad and attributing bad things to herself, may feel that he's the richest person in the world and go about spending money that he doesn't have. That is the category of mental illness. And you can imagine, if you feel you are the richest person in the world, if you are ill in that way, you will actually enjoy being that way. And if people are now trying to, quote unquote, treat you and make you stop feeling that way, you will resist it. So mental illness is the only type of illness in the world that in some categories may actually be enjoyable. So just like the woman with psychotic depression who's saying who is said to be a witch and who is saying how bad she is, the person who thinks he's the richest man in the world and is spending money that he doesn't have is also representing another category, very rare but present, of mental illness. So it is a unique category of illness. It's the only illness, the only type of illness in which society has had, in extreme cases, to empower some professionals to take people and treat them, even when they don't think there's anything wrong with them, and even when they don't want to be treated. And the reasons why that empowerment has been given to psychiatrists, you can understand from the two very extreme examples that I've given. I've given a very bad one, and I've also given a very, quote-unquote, happy one. But neither of them is normal, and neither of them would admit that they are ill. So neither of them will voluntarily take treatment. But in doing that, I've just given very extreme examples, and I've also given you a reason why mental illness has been stigmatized over time, why discussing mental health and illness like this has not been a conventional or polite thing, because people always look at the extremes. I mean, when people, as Professor Akish said earlier, when people many years ago talked about mental illness, they were talking about were, which is the Yoruba way of talking about the category of illness we call psychosis. Psychosis is a set of conditions like those two extremes that I described, when the person is out of touch with reality. It is present, but it is very, very rare. And it is actually not the reason why we are here to talk, because most people who are mentally ill are not psychotic. And to confuse the picture further, there's a difference between having the symptoms of mental illness and having an established mental illness. All of us, without exception, from time to time experience symptoms of mental illness. I'm sure there's nobody here who has never felt anxious. I'm sure there's nobody here who has never felt sad. Whether the person knows the reason for it or not. I'm sure there's nobody here who has never experienced sleepless nights. I'm sure there's nobody here who has never felt frustrated to the point where they don't want to see anybody, at least for some time. All of those are actually mental health symptoms. But I'm sure none of the people sitting here who have experienced those things, including myself, would agree that they are mentally ill, because they are not. So how do you distinguish the experience of mental health symptoms from the actuality of mental illness? What is the relationship? That is what we are going to talk about, because there's a lot of disinformation about mental health and illness. The reason why it went from being a taboo topic to a popular topic that everybody talks about has been the effect of the COVID-19 lockdown and pandemic that we had a few years ago. During that time, most normal activities were shut down. People were confined to their houses. People were afraid for their lives. Many people died. People were afraid for their future. Under those circumstances, people became very acutely aware of the challenges that were happening to their mental health, and they became very aware of the need to protect their mental health. People who never talked about mental health or illness before suddenly became very vocal in acknowledging that we were experiencing severe symptoms and they needed help. I was in the system then, and we needed to open care lines. We needed to open health lines. For the first time in Lagos, we needed to have lines that people could call when they were feeling really terrible, or when they were some feeling that they were about to die, or they wanted to die. So we needed to have helplines to help them and guide them through and help them to relieve some of their symptoms. That was not just a Nigerian experience, it was all over the world. The only positive thing about COVID-19 was that after that experience, nobody could say they were not aware of the issue of mental health and the existence of mental illness. And nobody could say that it could never affect them or their families. And nobody could say that it was not important. So that was, if you like, the only positive thing that the world gained from COVID-19, that it brought mental health challenges to the forefront and made it a discussion topic that gained great visibility, and also got attention so that it helped to develop and expand services for the care of people who had mental health challenges. It also made it easier for people, for the silent majority who are suffering from treatable mental illnesses, to come forward and seek help. Previously, people suffered in silence. The statistics, even now in Nigeria, are really horrible. More than 70% of people who have diagnosable mental illness of any sort or other, more than 70% of them in Nigeria today don't even tell their neighbor, not to talk of looking for somebody who can help them. Of course, the services, the people who can help them, there's a scarcity of those services. But even with that scarcity, the services are not being fully utilized because people keep it under wraps until they have problems that they can no longer hide. So we don't seek help, and often we seek help too late. But previously we were not even seeking help or even acknowledging the problem at all. So people suffered silently. There was a cost to that silent suffering. It was not only affected the lives of individual people who were like walking wounded, what you would call walking wounded, people who were not well, but who were still able to go to work. They could be workers in Mazio Hamua's factory, for instance, and they would go there and they present themselves and sign the register, but they are doing no work, or they are not as productive as they are supposed to be. So not only were they suffering internally, but their families and the networks in which they are meant to be adding value were also suffering. So bringing mental health issues to the forefront and making them a legitimate discussion topic frees everybody. And this is part of that process. And I acknowledge the effort of the board and committee for tabling this at this time. It is very, very appropriate. I can now go into the main body of the, but it's really meant to be a free-flowing discussion. Next slide, please. So what is mental health? What is wellness? What does illness mean? Is everybody who shows mental health symptoms ill? Our key objective in this brief talk is to look at how to maintain good mental health in ourselves and those around us, how to prevent mental illness from occurring in ourselves or those around us, and how to help to mitigate the effects of mental illness if and when it occurs either to ourselves or to other people. We are going to touch on a few common mental illnesses in our environment so that we can recognize them, so that all of us will be able to recognize them by the time we leave here. We will discover how sometimes we may be able to help directly, such as in giving a listening ear to our friends and loved ones who are going through difficult life circumstances. Sometimes all we can do, unfortunately, is not to offer help directly, but to point out to them the need and the way to seek help. We shall look at how our Christian community can create structures and activities to make life better for people with mental health problems, including ourselves, naturally. We shall conclude by looking at lifestyle issues and prevention strategies and try to create a roadmap to a mentally healthy future, not only for ourselves personally, but for our community, our society, our church, our families. So first things first. Next slide. Yeah, that's right. What is mental health? And secondly, why should it be a matter of interest to an eminent Christian audience such as the good people of AVMCC? Next slide, yeah. We may look on mental health as a state of well-being that enables the individual to cope with the stresses of life, to realize his or her abilities, to learn well, to work well, and to be able to contribute to the community. All those attributes are things that we take for granted. We think that normal life involves that we should normally be able to cope with the stresses of life, that we should be able to realize our potential, develop ourselves to the best that we can be, that we should be able to learn reasonably well, work reasonably well, whether we are working in our own business or in somebody else's business. And that we should be able to contribute meaningfully to our community, whether it is the church or the LCDA where we live or wherever. Next slide. So we'll take a quick look at those elements of what that I say contribute to mental health or define mental health. We described it as a state of well-being. We say that it enables us as the individual to cope with the stresses of our lives. We say that it helps us to realize our potential. We say that it helps us to learn well. We say that it helps us to work well. And it enables us to contribute to the community. We take all of those things for granted. Everybody, I believe, if I put those as boxes, all of us will tick those boxes and believe that they apply to themselves. And that's how we know or we believe that we are well. And that is probably true for most of us. There are three additional elements that constitute mental health. the ability to relate well with other people and to feel at peace with them, including our loved ones, our fellow workers, and even perfect strangers. When we get out on the road, normally we don't start shouting at or boxing the person who is walking on the road beside us. So we are relating well with people now. Although when you look at some scenes in the average day in Nigeria, when you pass a bus stop and you see how fractious and aggressive people's behavior is, you can see that a lot of average Nigerians are manifesting, they are falling short in this element of being able to relate well with their neighbors. So it is part of evidence of a mental health challenge, but it doesn't make the diagnosis. The ability to feel at peace with the world around us and the ability to feel at peace with God. I've just added those to the previous elements that I described, that if you tick those boxes, you say that you are in good mental health. I want to relate mental health to a concept that people don't usually use when they give talks like this, but which many of us will have heard of. That is wellness. Wellness is a very important thing, and many of us who are in corporate practice will have had symposia or undergone workshops costing a lot of money to the corporate entity to help to enhance the wellness of the workers. The big shots, the corporate bigwigs who sponsor such things, who sponsor wellness training exercises for their workers, they are not generally doing it out of philanthropy. They are doing it because they know that if the workers are not well, then they cannot be very productive. And unfortunately, that is a reality in many environments in Nigeria. People produce suboptimally because they carry about burdens within themselves which limit their ability to function. But they still come and sign the register and sit at the desk from 9 to 5. It is something that we call presentism. They are present, but they are not really delivering. So it is in your own interest as the employer to actually ask the guy, are you well? And if you are not well, can I pay to help you to get well or to help you to keep well? It is not philanthropy. It is that if you do that for your workers, if most of your workers are well, then they are productive. On the other side, if most of your workers are working wounded people who are carrying unwellness within themselves, but they are still present, signing the register, your company is losing. The money that you spend to help them to get and sustain wellness is smaller than the cost, than what you are losing by having a large number of people who are not well working for you. That's a truism, and it's not just about mental illness or mental wellness. This is about general wellness. The relationship between health and wellness is between mental health and wellness is a very important one. Wellness, I can define wellness for you as the state of being in good health, especially as an actively pursued goal. Wellness is active and process-oriented, while health is more like a state of being. It's a very nuanced thing, but it's good to understand the difference. What's the difference between wellness and health? Wellness is what you carry about. I can walk to that back door, to the south door, and walk back. I feel I'm well, Health is what you have. So health is static, it is inherent, it is present. Wellness is a continuous and dynamic thing, and it can change anytime. Next slide. Wellness experts talk about different dimensions of wellness, and that is what that will signifies. Because it tries to say, what are the things that can decide whether anybody sitting here is well or not? And let me give you some of those things, and you'll recognize that it is true that if they are not present, you can't say you are well. Financial is one of them. If you are truly, truly broke and you don't know where your next meal is going to come from, as you are sitting here, will you be feeling well? Okay. If you are physically unwell, if you are physically ill, you're having a severe pain, you certainly will not be feeling well and comfortable as you are sitting. If you are spiritually troubled, you will not have an experience. If somebody asks you, are you well? If you want to be honest, you will not say that you are feeling well. You are not feeling as good as you'd like to be. If you have problems with your environment, if you are living in a very noisy environment where you can't get to sleep or where you can't even think, where you have a headache once you come in, you cannot have good health and you cannot sustain it. You cannot say you are well. If you are emotionally troubled, you cannot say you are well. If you don't have a job, or if you are in a job that you don't like, every time you enter the office or enter the factory, you begin to feel awful, you cannot say that you are well. If you are in socially troubled circumstances, you are in perpetual odds with your spouse, you cannot say that you are well. So, although health is something that belongs to us, there are so many things outside us that affect us. And if those things are not under control, then we are not well. And it's important to know. So your mental health is not, your physical or mental health is not just about what is happening inside you. A lot of it is also about what is happening around you. And that is an important thing that we all need to get. Next slide. Okay. The message from all of that preamble is that there is no health without mental health. And the second message is that there is no mental health when the factors around your life are not under good control. So it is not just about you. And this next slide is just a joke slide. When we were in medical school, we were taught about how to recognize different types of headache. I'm sure there's nobody here who has not had a headache at least once in the past 1 month, even if it's just a mild and transitory. Professors taught us that if you have a migraine, it tends to affect the area of your eyes. And your eyes can be red and they can be watering. And if you have hypertension, most people who have hypertension don't have any symptoms. But if you have a headache that is caused by hypertension, it's likely to be in the occiput, in the back of your head, towards the neck. If your headache is caused by stress, it's likely to be like a band at the back of your head and then going to the areas of the temples like a band tightening your whole head. Now, who knows, what about the last one? The one that covers everywhere. What do you think is likely to cause that kind of headache? If you have wife or husband trouble, you cannot look at all the theories of our professors that they taught us in medical school do not apply to you. Your headache will be everywhere. This is not medical. This is just to illustrate the fact that your wellness often is not just about you, but about things that are outside of you. What are the commonest symptoms of mental health problems? Many of the experiences and complaints that are associated with mental illness are also experienced by normal people. I took time to dwell on that in the preamble so that we can all know that it's not an alien experience. When people talk about mental illness, it's not something that lives on another planet. I've never had it before. So I generalized and I said that there's nobody here who has never experienced a symptom of mental illness, and that is true, including myself. Okay? But experiencing a symptom of mental illness, or even experiencing several symptoms of mental illness, does not mean that you actually have mental illness. So how do we distinguish? Mental illness has come more prominently into public discussion as a result of advocacy and due to our recent COVID-19 experience. However, we should not be too quick to diagnose mental illness or to label other people because we don't like them or like their behavior. That will be stigma. And Professor Kishota mentioned stigma previously. Stigma is a discriminatory attitude towards people who are said to have mental illness. But if you are looking, but that is only possible if you are looking at it as if they are different from you. If you are looking at it as if that population actually includes you, then it's very difficult to discriminate against yourself. So it's an us and us thing rather than a we and you or a we and them thing. How do I know I have a mental health problem? We are getting into the core of the subject now. The defining issue is often the intensity and the appropriateness of the symptoms that you are experiencing. It is normal to feel grief when we lose a loved one. But if you are still depressed and unable to cope or carry out everyday life functions 1 year after losing someone, there's a problem there. If a person is anxious, it is normal for a person to feel anxious when they're about to go in and make a presentation to their boss at work. Okay? But if they are still feeling that anxiety 1 month after, there's a problem there. Anxiety and depression of various categories and subtypes are the commonest forms of mental illness. All of us experience them in transient symptoms. More than 20% of us will have at least one experience that fits the diagnosis of illness of one type or other in the course of our lifetime. Mental illness is among the commonest illnesses known to man. It's among the costliest, whether it is treated or untreated, and it is among the most disabling. But also it's important to know that there are many different types of mental illness. So mental illness isn't just one thing. It is several things. Some of them are mild. The relatively mild ones are the most common ones, anxiety, depression. Some of them are severe and intractable, like what I described as psychosis, but they are also very, very rare. So the ones that you are likely to encounter or experience are the relatively mild ones, and they are not. The understanding you need to have about them is different from the understanding we had a long time ago when we were discriminating against the people who are walking naked on the street, who are the minority that are called psychotic illness. So types of mental illness: anxiety. I hope you can see that diagram. That person is, very fearful and is bent inwards onto himself or herself. The usual symptoms are feeling of excessive fear and apprehension, a feeling of nervousness. The person is unable to relax. The person feels irritable. He has difficulty in concentrating on any task, e.g. work. He may have physical symptoms such as trembling, shaking of the hands, sweating. He may have diarrhea. People often have diarrhea or stomach pain when they are summoned in to see their boss at work, especially when they feel that they may be about to earn a query. But if you have one that is severe and sustained, then there's a problem that you have. That's not situational. The symptoms must persist for at least 2 weeks in order to make a diagnosis of illness. As I've said, all of us, the symptoms are described, all of us experience them from time to time. But we don't experience them for 1 week or 2 weeks at a stretch. If you are experiencing if those things are there and they are continuous for up to 2 weeks, then it is fit and appropriate to say that you are suffering from anxiety as an illness. There are several different types of anxiety-related illness which we don't need to bother about, such as phobias and obsessions. But it's important just to know the basic symptoms and to know that all of us experience those symptoms But if they are severe, inappropriate, and persistent for a certain period of time, that is when they qualify to be labeled illness. Depression. Depression is the other major, very, very common type of. Between anxiety and depression, if you add them together, they are by far the overwhelming majority of the population that are labeled as mentally ill. Most of the other mental illnesses are in terms of statistics, are relatively insignificant. The most significant ones, in terms of how common they are anxiety and depression. So those are the ones we are focusing on. There are different types of depression. Depression may occur in either sex, but they are more common in women than men for some reason. Somebody said it's because of the men. The central thing, the most important feeling that you have when they say you are depressed is that you have a persistent feeling of sadness. The person may lose interest in their usual activities, including food, physical intimacy, care of spouse, or even care of children. So you may find a mother with a newborn neglecting her child. Somebody who likes food will stop eating and start to lose weight. The things that the person normally likes to do, she loses interest in doing them. The person may be less willing to interact or communicate with other people. Somebody who is usually the heart and soul of the party will stop taking her phone calls when you call her, or will not want to speak with anybody. She just wants to sit in the room and do nothing. The person may weep. The person may feel suicidal if it is severe. The person may actually attempt suicide. We had the story of somebody who jumped off the 3rd Mainland Bridge last week. As told to us by Professor Akin. It's been in the news, and it's a common thing. And usually a person like that is suffering from depression. In terms of attempting suicide, I may just as well say that women attempt suicide more commonly than men. But there is another side to the coin. Men succeed in committing the suicide more commonly than the women. I think the lady who jumped off the bridge, she did it when there were people there. And so she was rescued. Maybe if a man is going to do it, he'll probably go and jump when there's nobody, and you won't even know about it. The person who is depressed, a person who is severely depressed may say or believe bad things about himself or herself. I gave the example of those old women that they were stoned to death in our villages in the past because they said bad things about themselves. Whatever. The person may feel hopeless. The onset may follow a sad event or may come out of the blue. Another category of, next slide please. Another category of mental illness I want to discuss, because they are very common, is stress-related conditions. Now, stress is a major factor of life. More people report mental health problems during periods when there are problems in society, such as what we have now, or during the COVID-19, or when there is a war, or when there is famine. Usually there are more people reporting symptoms of mental illness because of the stress. Stress was responsible for the upsurge in the mental health problems during COVID-19 pandemic and lockdown. Stress is a sense of wear and tear that we all experience in difficult situations as a result of internal or external events. Common illnesses related to stress include acute stress reaction and post-traumatic stress reaction. Post-traumatic stress disorder occurs in people who experience traumatic events such as kidnapping, fire, or road traffic accidents. In my professional life, I've had to go to the oil producing areas where at a certain time when kidnapping was quite rampant, and to help the families of people who were kidnapped, and also to help the colleagues of the people who were kidnapped, because knowing somebody or having somebody close to you who is kidnapped, or being the person who is kidnapped, is one of the most traumatic experiences in the world. And even after the ransom is paid or you are rescued, that's when your problems just begin. That's when you begin to suffer if you don't acknowledge it as a problem. So stress-related problems are very, very important, and they take very different dimensions. Again, all of us experience stress. The reality is that our stress does not last. You come out of your house and you're eager to get to work, and you try to start your car and the car doesn't start. I'm sure that's a familiar experience. But you just, apart from getting annoyed, you quickly think of an alternative. Maybe you're going to call a Uber or jump on a bus or whatever. But if you turn on that car and it doesn't start, and you take a stone and you begin to break the windshield and you begin to scream, not only people will say you are mad, but what has happened is that you have probably suffered accumulated stress, and that last event, which may look trivial, is what they call the last straw that breaks the back of the camel. Most of the people will not know what you have been experiencing in the past. The accumulation of provocations. Maybe your wife slapped you. She didn't give you didn't eat last night. Your pay has been deducted in the office, and all of, and then you now get up this morning and the car doesn't start. So it's just the car not starting and your reaction to it that they will see. But all the things in the past that you've experienced contribute to what reaction you are going to have and whether you develop an illness from it. Another category of mental illness that I'd like, which is now very, very important for all of us to know about, is dementia. We have, although people complain about our poor health services, I think those complaints are both legitimate and exaggerated. Our health services have actually developed in breadth, and we are able to do a lot more now than we were able to do in the past. People are actually living longer in Nigeria now than they did in the past. The average man lives to be 60. The average woman lives to be 64. So the women are still getting preferential treatment. But in other parts of the world, people live to be 80, 90. In Japan, the average, the life expectancy is between 85 and 90. So we still have some way to go. But because people are living longer, we're also accumulating baggage that was not very visible before. Because as people age, there are problems that come, and one of them is dementia. Dementia is quite common. By the time people are 65, about 10% of them will have some level of dementia. That's like 1 in 10. If this place is full of 65-year-olds, you can count 1 in 10 of them will have, it's not from a range from minor to severe Alzheimer's dementia. By the time people are 85, 1 out of every 3 of them will have some form of dementia. So it's good to grow old gracefully, but it also comes with a baggage in the sense of increased medical costs and an increased range of services that we are all going to need, and that entities such as even church organizations and the church themselves and the church itself needs to start to contribute to. Old age comes with a baggage of increased physical and mental illness. There are different types of dementia, including some that start at a relatively young age. The commonest and most worrisome one is the so-called Alzheimer's disease. The symptoms include increasing loss of memory, confusion, behavioral changes, poor sleep. Advanced dementia may be very difficult for families to manage at home. I don't want people living here, especially with the older ones, starting to worry when you forget where you left your keys. that, doesn't, that doesn't mean that you have dementia. So don't overdiagnose. It's just a pointer. So in any case, there is some amount of normal, in quotes, memory decline that happens with age. That doesn't meet the full criteria for defining dementia. I've already talked about what are the things you need to have in order for anybody to say you have dementia. I'll say them again. The increasing decline of memory, confusion, behavioral changes, poor sleep, to a point where the person may become totally unmanageable, may not remember the names of her children or his children, and may not want to eat, may not be able to find their way to the bathroom. I'm sure none of us here is experiencing that full panoply. But it's good that we should know about it as a reality of life. Professional caring and development of residential facilities for the elderly are gradually increasing in Nigeria, but not fast enough to cope with the need, which is only going to increase as our population grows older and we all live longer. Drug abuse is another category of issues that at least I need to mention in passing. It remains a major problem among our youth. All of us have heard about the exploits of the agencies charged with interdicting, with reducing demand and reducing supply of drugs in our society. The consensus is that General Marwa is doing a fantastic job, but also what has come to the fore is that drug is big business in Nigeria now, and there are people who are making billions of naira or even dollars from it, who have a vested interest in ensuring that they have a user population who are your children, or the young people who are mostly your children and the young people who are being recruited or being lured into drug use. Because if there's no market, then it's not profitable. They have to export, and it's more difficult to export. It's easier to just sell in your neighborhood with the neighborhood malam. So the children can go to the neighborhood malam and buy Canadian loud. Unfortunately, that is the truth about how we are now. And we should not be worried about it. And nobody should be saying it can't happen to me. It can happen to anybody. And we all, as a society, bear the consequences. NDLA is striving to reduce supply, but demand remains high in some sectors of the population. For example, opioids in cough mixtures are very popular in the north, especially among housewives. You can guess at the reason for that. The war against drug abuse, especially among the younger population, is a battle our society cannot afford to lose. Every psychiatrist, every mental health care worker can quote examples of lives that have been damaged by drugs. And those lives they cut across all population categories, all social and economic level categories. Finally, next slide, please. Other mental health problems that at least you should know about in passing. I've mentioned the so-called psychosis, which are individual, in which case an individual loses touch with reality. The most prominent example is schizophrenia. This, unfortunately, used to be the face of mental illness. Whenever anybody talked about anybody being mentally ill, they were usually talking about people with schizophrenia. Very few, the overwhelming majority of people with mental illness don't have schizophrenia. That's the truth. But that's how they've labeled the illness, and that's why people with anxiety have just kept quiet, so as not to be labeled, so that they are not going to be sad by them. Because at a certain time, once your boss heard that you'd receive treatment for any mental illness, you are marked down for gentle easing out of the company. And that is wrong. That is stigma. There are mental health symptoms that are caused by physical illness, such as high fever, injury to the brain tumor, or genetic or birth abnormalities. There are also mental health problems that affect children, such as autism and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. We now come to the meat of the matter. Next slide, please. All of this it's good to know. But I'm sure the question you'd like to ask me is, what can we do? And that's both for ourselves and for other people. The purpose of taking such a bird's eye view of mental health is not to gawk at the funny examples that I've given or at the wide range of what can go wrong. It is not to label or abuse others by giving them diagnosis. So I'm hoping nobody will leave here and then when they get to the office tomorrow, they're going to tap somebody on the shoulder and say, that your friend is schizophrenic. That would be an abuse of half knowledge, okay? Because that is stigma. And it is certainly not to stigmatize people with mental health problems by seeing them as a special group of people. Hopefully by now we have established that all of us are prone to mental health problems. All of us from time to time have symptoms of mental illness. But all of the symptoms that we have often are not severe enough or long enough to meet the criteria for diagnosing mental illness. That doesn't mean that we should ignore them. That doesn't mean that we should trivialize them. If you are feeling unhappy or feeling anxious, it doesn't mean you should just accept it because it's not up to 2 weeks. You can and should do something about it. Our interventions are determined by our positions, and I'm going to prescribe some interventions that belong to some categories of people. For instance, if you are an employer of labor, like my friend Mazi, I'm sure there are many employers of labor here, and you have somebody who is receiving treatment for any mental health problem, you should be sympathetic and considerate instead of trying quickly to get them off your payroll and out of your company. That's very important. It is a difficult thing to do, but we've also established on the basis of statistics that having been treated for, first of all, that there's a wide range of mental illnesses. The most common mental illnesses are anxiety and depression. People, even with untreated anxiety or untreated depression, are presidents of countries and prime ministers and CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. So you really have no excuse to. If somebody is not performing well, you can look actually at that person, see why he's not performing. If they are defaulting on their treatment or they're not getting treatment, you can help them to get treatment. Rather than say, you are mentally ill, or I heard that you went to see a psychiatrist last week. You can no longer work in my company. You could be cutting your nose to spite your face because you could be losing your best staff, apart from showing a very uncaring and very uncivilized employer attitude. Now, we finish with employers. What about if you are a friend, colleague, or neighbor, or a member of a church society, or associated in some other way with somebody who has a diagnosis of mental illness? If you observe that somebody close to you is having problems in living, they are going through a difficult marriage, they're having problems at work, they're always talking about their problems at home and stuff like that, at the very least, you should show a sympathetic attitude and you should show a readiness to help in other ways. We looked at the wheel of wellness and we talked about things that can so destabilize you that you begin to show evidence of illness. For instance, if a person has not paid his house rent for 6 months and is facing the possibility of ejection and they tell you, but what other people are saying is that they are very restless in the office, they can't concentrate, the work that they are turning in is for the person who goes and types something and is full of grammatical errors. If you want to be sympathetic and you actually listen, you are the colleague of the person and you actually listen, and then you hear where it is coming from, that the person is flat broke and is facing ejection at home. It may fall to you to be the one to intervene by organizing a collection of financial assistance for that person. And you'll be surprised at how quickly the symptoms that the person is having disappear, because you made a connection between what is happening to their lives and what they are displaying. You haven't thrown them away or labeled them. Mental health is influenced by a large number of factors which may be described as problems in living. Someone may be having difficulty paying school fees or rent. They may be having problems in their marriage. As a general rule, episodes of mental breakdown are often precipitated or sustained by so-called life events. You may also help to channel the person gently towards professional care. What about if you are a spouse of somebody who is showing mental health symptoms? It gets closer to the skin and more closer to the bone. It is your duty as a spouse to channel your partner into appropriate care and to offer sympathetic support. Sometimes mental illness leads to a deterioration in spousal relationship, and it is a frequent cause of marital breakup. It does not have to be. So a lot of relationship breakups and a lot of family dysfunction that often happen because one member of that family either has an unrecognized mental illness or has a mental illness that other people are reacting to. So it is not now, so the baggage is now worse than the illness itself, because most of those illnesses are relatively easy to treat. But the baggage can be a broken marriage or a loss of job, which is harder to fix. What about if you are a church? And I was hoping that this message will get all the way up to my Lord Bishop and to the dean of the cathedral and to the generality of the congregation. In a situation where I said earlier, I don't know if I mentioned the statistics, at least 20% of all of us, of any population anywhere in the world, would experience at least one properly diagnosable episode of mental illness at least once in their lifetime. This is now not just talking about just feeling a transient anxiety or feeling depressed because you had a quarrel with your wife. It is having a real illness that is sustained for sufficient. 1 in 5 of us will sometime in our lives, whether we are young or old, before we leave this world, 1 in 5 of every population will have one properly diagnosable mental illness. Given that statistic, it means that the bishop or the minister of a large congregation such as this needs to be seeing it as a statistical reality that many of his members will be having an ongoing or potential mental illness at any one time. Should he close his eyes or should he just organize talks? Are there things that he can do? The church must participate in the work of mitigating and preventing mental illness in our society. What are the areas in which the church can help? Creation of counseling clinics in larger parishes. That is a growing trend. And I hope AVMCC has latched onto it because it's very important. Such clinics use the services of properly trained, I emphasize properly trained there, properly trained counselors to interface with people who come forward because they are troubled, they are having problems in living. Their symptoms may not even fully match the severity that will make them diagnosable as illness. But they have symptoms, and the longer you have symptoms and the causes of the symptoms are not ameliorated in any way, the more likely it is that things will get bad. So a church with a counseling clinic is a church that is realistic and showing willingness to help people who are living through difficult circumstances. Counseling, which is not the same as offering well-intentioned advice, which we all do, is a form of superficial psychotherapy that may help many people with their basic emotional problems. It is the mental health equivalent of primary health care. Professor Akishete will know about, and all the medical people here will know about this. Primary health care deals with the most basic needs of society, but most basic health needs of society, such as vaccination, treatment of malaria, and stuff like that. But for most of the population, those basic needs are what we need. So if that primary health care is well structured and it is there. Most of us do not need to go to the big hospitals. In the same way, when there are counselors available who are able to help people and talk people through their basic problems in living, the need to have cases deteriorate to really bad levels where they need full-blown professional care is diminished. It will still be there, but the statistics show that it is diminished. Counseling is, of course, not without risk, and even the best trained counselors must recognize their limits and be ready to recognize people whose problems are beyond their level so that they can refer them upwards to the most appropriate care. Continuing with what I think the church should do. Some churches have chosen to intervene in the following areas. Some churches have built rehabilitation centers for treatment and rehabilitation of drug and alcohol problems. I'm sure all of us know about Kadam, which belongs to the Redeemed Church, and Pastor Aku's outfit and other things. Some churches have built or are intending to build facilities for the care of the elderly. These include homes for short and long-term custodial care. This is especially relevant to cope with the increasing number of elders with advanced dementia who cannot be cared for at home. I must tell you sincerely, it is very, very difficult to look after an 80-year-old person who has severe dementia. No matter how devoted the wife or the husband is, or how caring the children are, it is very, very difficult without specialized assistance in the form of maybe carers. It is so bad, the person may be wetting themselves, the person may not know their way to the bathroom, the person may not even recognize their children. In very extreme cases, it is very, very difficult thing, and a lot of professional assistance and input is required. And sometimes the best thing, either for short or long periods, is to have care centers where, even if it's just a relief admission, the people who are looking after the elderly person at home can get a relief of a week or two while they are staying in such circumstances. In some other cases, they stay there almost endlessly. And that's the pattern all over the world. We used not to favor so-called old people's homes because we said it wasn't part of our culture. When I was training in psychiatry, I was bragging to my colleagues in Edinburgh that we look after our elderly people. We have a large extended family system. So no matter how demented an elderly person becomes in an environment, he will still have a place in the homestead. But all the homesteads in reality have disappeared. What we have are people living in flats or houses in the city, and the husband goes to work, the wife goes to work. So to look after grandpa who cannot find his way to the bathroom in that environment is very, very difficult, no matter how caring you are. So you need assistance. Some churches have chosen to intervene in the following areas: building rehabilitation centers, building facilities for the elderly, creation of daycare facilities for the elderly in the community so that they can stay busy and active. This is not even just about dementia now, but making life useful and productive and interesting for the elderly. If we do that, it actually helps to reduce it helps to delay the advent of dementia. It helps, the longer you're able to keep older people mentally active and engaged for, the less risk you are likely to face of having a large population of people with advanced dementia. In other societies, you have in communities, some people use church halls. Every week, there are occupational therapists and church workers who will take vehicles and carry some of the elderly from the neighborhood, and they spend all day there. They eat, they play games, they chat, they make new friends, and then they take them back home in the evening. That's a daycare facility. And that is something that our churches should be looking at. But not just for the members of their church, but as a service to the community. It will help us to manage the increasing number of elderly in our community and help to keep them well for longer. Creation of a welfare fund to help needy members access professional medical services. Psychiatric care, mental health care is quite expensive in our country still, despite, and not everybody has health insurance. So if a good church will have a welfare fund from which some needy members can get assistance to get professional mental health care. Facilitating regular advocacy against stigma and discussing other mental health issues. Organizing domestic campaigns against drug abuse among the youth. How do we prevent mental illness? I said earlier that wellness is a protection against illness. We must try to embrace and sustain wellness in all areas of our lives. That means socially we are naturally, and we have some things going for us. We are naturally gregarious people. We like to associate with other people. The fact of the matter is that people who associate with other people suffer less frequent mental illness and recover faster from mental illness than people who are socially isolated. So we have a built-in insurance against mental illness that we don't use enough. We blame ourselves for, and we abuse ourselves about our tendency, our love for Owambe parties. But Owambe parties are actually quite good, especially if we patronize them or do them in moderation. We don't bankrupt ourselves to hold Owambe parties. We don't attend every party, but it's good to go to parties. It's good to associate in a joyful atmosphere with people. It helps to preserve our mental wellness. Financial, everybody should do their best to manage their finances effectively, because poor management of finances is one of the vulnerability factors for developing mental illness. Physical, we should all pay attention to our physical health and do regular medical checkups. By the time we are getting into our 50s and 60s, we should be going to do routine checkups at least twice a year. Environment, we should do our best to cultivate a clean, congenial, safe environment. Intellectual, we should keep our brains active. Don't switch off when you retire. Keep abreast of developments, know what is happening around you. Discuss politics with people. I know Nigerian politics can be frustrating, but get the frustration out of your system. You can abuse the president or abuse your governor. It's actually therapeutic for you, as long as you are not picked up. Occupational, it is good to work. So even if you are retired, you should continue to work. Work doesn't mean working to earn money. You can work voluntarily. You can do things for people. Emotional. Do not carry emotional baggage. Let go of old grievances. That is a major issue with all of us. We carry grievances. And grievances are like a load that you put on your shoulder. And unfortunately, as you grow older, if you don't get rid of old loads and you are just adding new ones, you won't know when the thing so weighs you down that you are not even able to step forward and enjoy the life you are living. Spiritual. It is well proven that a solid spiritual life is an insulation against mental illness, and we should all seek to be close to God in our various ways. How do we prevent mental illness? We try to minimize stress and maximize our ability to live with it. Anybody can have a breakdown, whether physical or mental, if they are sufficiently stressed. There's nobody in the world who cannot have a breakdown if you stress them enough. Some people will say, nothing can touch me. It's just a matter of cranking up that thing, and eventually you get to the level where you have your own breakdown. Live a healthy lifestyle with adequate recreation and physical exercise. Eat good nutrition. Be connected with others, family, friends. Have affectionate relationships with family members, spouse, wife. Isolated people, as I said before, are more prone to mental illness and have fewer chances of recovery. Be kind and generous. That may sound strange, but people who are generous, people who give, are actually better insulated against mental illness than people who take all the time. It's not the pastor talking now, it is actually the professional talking that you benefit from giving to. Don't say, what do I have that I can even give? Me, I'm still suffering. You can give something. And I'm not just talking about church contributions, I'm talking about giving to impact other people's lives. And you find that you get a secret satisfaction from it that can be cumulative. It can almost be like drinking good wine or doing something that you can, in the deep of your heart, when you're alone, it will just come to you that you've done a good deed. Finally, have a good relationship with God. And we are in the house of God, so I don't need to say that. I need to put a caveat after having said all of these things. It is still possible that mental illness can occur despite the best efforts that we have described to prevent it. It may even occupy a significant place in a person's life despite their best efforts to mitigate it or to live a healthy life. Among the patients I've seen in the course of my professional life have been clergymen, very upstanding people you look up to, and people who are upstanding, who are good people, or who people see as good people, and people whom you learn to relate to God even through watching their manners, and yet they still fall ill. And sometimes you ask yourself, how does that happen? Now let me tell you a personal experience that explained that to me. Illness is a part of the human experience, and it may even be spiritual. I will always remember the words of the founding bishop of this diocese, the Right Reverend Dr. Peter Awilewa Adebi, on the day he came to commission the chapel of St. Luke's, which I told you earlier I regard as my family's church. Bishop Adebi was explaining why there would always be doctors, and why there will always be a need for hospitals, and why there will always be a need for hospital ministry, which all of you are doing. He quoted from Apostle Paul, as written in 2 Corinthians Corinthians 2, 7-9. To keep me, and these are the words of Apostle Paul, to keep me from becoming conceited because of these surpassingly great revelations, there was given me a thorn in my flesh. Some people here will be familiar with that passage. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in your weakness. So, being ill, suffering from illness, doesn't mean that God doesn't love you, or he doesn't care about you, or that you have offended him in some way. The great servant of God, Apostle Paul, lived for a major part of his life with that thorn in his flesh. And he communicated with God, and that was the answer that God gave to him. And he was satisfied with it. I thank you all for listening. I wish you all a happy Sunday and a blessed and glorious week ahead.
You can do better.